I am Tom Langford, and I want to welcome you to this occasion this evening. Almost a year ago now, President Kenan received a letter that was surprising, arresting, and challenging. The Kenan Trust wrote to ask if Duke University was interested in exploring the possibility of establishing a program in ethics across the university, and one that would have outreach beyond the university. President Kenan consulted with some people. The Board of Trustees had recently been trying to consider the mission of the university. It was felt that this sort of effort fit in some very unique ways that mission, and that we certainly should explore to see if a program could be devised that both recognized and honored the integrity of the university and reached beyond the university into the immediate and more long-range communities. The reply to the Kenan Trust was that we certainly wanted to make the effort, and in the months since, we've attempted to consider programs to look at the present and the future, and two or three things seem to be clear. One was that any program that was established should attempt to permeate the life of the whole university. Secondly, that any program was established should take seriously the interactions between the university and its surrounding communities. Now, a number of programs in ethics have been established in the United States in a number of colleges and universities. We were asking, are there things that could be done with such a program that would enhance Duke University and would enhance the constituencies to whom we're related and with whom we have mutual responsibilities? Slowly, we've attempted to put together aspects of such a program. Most of the things we've been doing have been tentative, attempting to come to understanding of the program in order to look for leadership, particularly in the person of a director, and then to move through the university from undergraduate freshman courses to graduate professional activities. We are still on the threshold of many things, but a number of things have already been done. Tonight we have the first public occasion of this program. It is for us auspicious because it is a way of saying publicly that we think we know enough about this to believe that it can be done and can be done significantly. Chief among those who have helped to imagine what a program might be and to help conceptualize ways we might go has been the President of Duke, Kenan. In recognizing her to introduce our speaker, I also wanted understood that we are recognizing the inauguration of an effort that can, in many ways, help form the life of this university and perhaps help enrich the interactions of this university with the larger world. President Kenan, we welcome you to introduce for us our first program within this program.
Thank you, Tommy Langford, and thank you for your own crucial leadership in this program. We would not be where we are today had you not been willing to take such an important role in shaping the program. In an era when everyone from presidential candidates to Hollywood producers at least professes to believe in the importance of morality, we have been determined from the start that the Kenan program in ethics would be more than just another of the large and proliferating number of courses and programs across the country which deal with ethics. We decided that our program would not simply consider ethics as a subject for education and research, but that it would involve broader elements of the university community and of our society in exploring the dimensions of ethical behavior in the lives of all of us, recognizing the embeddedness of the university in our community and our community in the university. Professor Langford has outlined some of the exciting initiatives which have already been associated with this program, but tonight's lecture, as he says, is the first event when we have been able to welcome people who have not yet been involved in shaping this program. Many members of the Duke faculty have already contributed much to thinking about this program, and we are pleased tonight to welcome more of you in this effort. This marks the beginning of our work involving the broader community, and I'm very pleased that we have been able to secure such a distinguished speaker for the first public event of the Kenan program. Our speaker tonight has built his career on keen observations of the human condition. As the urban affairs columnist for the Washington Post, William Raspberry has developed a national reputation for being a champion of truth and a writer who finds lessons for all of us in the full range of human experience. He is the son of school teachers in Mississippi, a graduate of Indiana Central College, which is now the University of Indianapolis, with a degree in history, which he has put to good effect in his columns, in his writings. He began his journalistic career with the Indianapolis Recorder. He spent there 4 years before joining the U.S. Army. And then when he left the Army, he went to work in 1962 as a teletype operator at the Washington Post, where he was soon promoted to reporter. And in 1966, he began writing a column which at first appeared on the Metro page of the Post, but was so popular that it was soon moved to the editorial section. And today the column is syndicated by the Washington Post Writers Group and appears in more than 200 newspapers across the country. I know that all of you in this room have read Bill Raspberry's columns. I was thinking of how appropriate it is on this day when the funeral of Ron Brown was held in Washington, that one of the most touching testimonials to his life and work was Bill Raspberry's column about Ron Brown. Professor Raspberry has a very distinctive touch in catalyzing our thoughts, our emotions, our ambitions at distinctive stages in our nation's history. He is the recipient of numerous awards and honors. He won the 1994 Pulitzer Prize for his commentary in writing on topics such as AIDS, the Nation of Islam, and violent rap music lyrics. And he's also author of a book, Looking Backward at Us, published in 1991. And today, as we are proud to say, in addition to informing and intriguing millions of readers across the country with his column, Bill Raspberry also plays a more direct role as an educator in his work here at Duke, where he is the Knight Professor of the Practice of Journalism in the Department of Public Policy Studies in the Trinity College of Arts and Sciences. And we thought it was especially appropriate in signaling our intention in the Kenan program to show the university in the community that we bring a distinguished professor at Duke who is also well known for his ability to speak to very broad audiences as the first Kenan lecturer. Whether he finds his topics in conversations with cab drivers, secretaries in the cabinet, or public policy students. Professor Raspberry's work is always characterized by clarity, wisdom, and a stubborn belief in the essential goodness of humanity. And thus he is an ideal choice to deliver this inaugural lecture in the Kenan program in ethics. And it gives me great pleasure to introduce our colleague, Professor Raspberry.
This is really a terrific honor to have been asked to do this tonight. I know what it means to you, President Cohen, and I know what it means to the university, and I'm extremely honored. I'm also well aware of just what it is I've been asked to do tonight. I've been asked to deliver the first lecture in a series of lectures on ethics, a task that implies a certain seriousness, even gravity. And though I usually manage to do what's expected of me, I think I won't tonight for a couple of reasons. The first is that in my vast experience as a university professor, I'm halfway through my second semester by now, I found that I'm not a particularly effective teacher if I'm too grave. The second is that since this is the very first Kenan ethics lecture in the series, I thought it might be just as well to make it a sort of preparatory talk. Let me introduce my subject as, in university terms, as pre-ethics. And if you'll allow me that privilege, maybe you'll allow me also to use ordinary words and ideas in place of the grander ones you're certain to hear as our series moves along. I intend to be in the audience for the rest of them, and I think we need to get off on a sort of solid footing where we're quite clear what we're talking about. So if you'll permit me, I'll start with simple arithmetic. Clever mathematicians can show you a dozen ways that 2 plus 2 can add up to something other than 4. And if you have a keen interest in how numbers work, you might find the alternative solutions intriguing. But if you intend to use numbers, if you expect to rely on numbers as a way of negotiating your way through everyday life, you do well to remember that in ordinary parlance, in the normal order of things, 2 and 2 nearly always do add up to 4. Neglect of that simple truth is likely to result not in mathematical enlightenment, but its opposite, utter confusion. And yet it is precisely this ordinary sense of things that sometimes gets lost when we set out to teach ethics. We teach puzzles, those exquisitely balanced lifeboat dilemmas with no right or wrong answers, and we imagine that by doing so we've given our young people some sense of the discipline of ethics. That may even be true for those with a philosophical bent. For the rest, though, I suspect the lesson is likely to be that in the amorphous math of ethics, 2 plus 2 can be whatever any individual imagines it to be. Christine Hoff Sommers talked about that. She's the philosophy professor over at Clark College. And she said it rather more eloquently than I'm going to say it tonight, but remember, this is pre-ethics, and I'm starting off simply. Here's what she said. Because the typical course in applied ethics concentrates on problems and dilemmas, the student may easily lose sight of the fact that some things are clearly right and wrong. that some ethical truths are not subject to serious debate. In other words, the puzzles and riddles aside, 2 and 2 do make 4. What Sommers was urging was a distinction between teaching about ethics and teaching ethics. Both are okay to do, as long as we understand that learning about ethics has about as much to do with ethical behavior as learning about religion has to do with salvation. Nobody ever had an epiphany while cramming for a final in comparative religion. Still, teaching ethical behavior as though there are objective rules governing what people ought to do strikes a lot of quite intelligent people as nothing more than brainwashing. Teach them to analyze the issues, we say. Teach them to predict outcomes, to measure results. But don't tell them what's right or wrong. Well, I think we've paid quite a dear price for our abandonment of clear-cut right and wrong pronouncements in favor of moral relativism. Our professions, our universities, and our high schools are discovering the dilemma we've created for ourselves. And it's this: you can't exercise moral authority while denying the authority of morality. And yet, particularly in our universities, we insist on teaching our young people to exert a societal morality, even while neglecting to develop their personal morality. A situation that Christine Sommers describes as ethics without virtue. I'm quoting her again. Students taking college ethics are debating abortion, euthanasia, capital punishment, DNA research, and the ethics of transplant surgery, while they learn almost nothing about private decency, honesty, personal responsibility, or honor. Topics such as hypocrisy, self-deception, cruelty, or selfishness rarely come up. Well, the immediate objection to teaching ethics, as opposed to teaching about ethics, is that ethics is such an utterly subjective thing. Well, it's true. But while any reasonably bright college student ought to be able to come up with a short list of behaviors that would have different ethical values in different societies, different religions, or even different parts of town, the effort necessary to produce such a list ought to drive home the essential point. In most real-world situations, mathematical and ethical, 4 is most often the right answer, and you ought to stick with it until it's proven to be wrong. Now, Christine Sommers recognizes that there are some intellectually engaging ethical dilemmas. And I don't mean to downplay those. I mean, for instance, what's the proper response of a moral relativist professor of ethics who discovers that her class has cheated on the exam? But she also thinks that a society that refuses to pass along its ethical as well as its technological and cultural heritage is hastening its own demise. Teach virtue? Well, yes, she says, and it's not as hard as we sometimes imagine. Schools, including great universities like this one, should have codes of behavior that stress kindness, civility, and honesty. You see, our biggest ethical problem is not to figure out these really incredibly difficult things like, at what point does a reporter stop being a journalist and start being a human being? If he's caught in a situation where he's covering a flood and there's a need for somebody to pass sandbags, does he put down his pen and notepad and start passing sandbags and miss the story? Or should the Washington Post and the New York Times have published the Unabomber's manifesto? I mean, truly difficult questions, and I don't know the answers. I'm suggesting, though, that the more immediate problem for our pre-ethics course tonight is not involved with these really tough issues, but a simpler one. How to persuade people to do the right thing when they know what the right thing is. We should stop accusing our teachers of brainwashing for teaching the fundamental values of our society. Our children should be told, even when they're quite young, those stories that reinforce virtue. You see, I warned you up front that this is going to be a terribly basic, elementary lecture just to get us going. And these things are quite ordinary. Indeed, we used to do them all. We used to teach our children through fable, Bible stories, heroes' lives, and family myths what ethical behavior, what goodness was all about. Now we teach them lifeboat dilemmas and wonder why they're not inspired. I suggest that before we get too deeply involved in teaching those exquisite exceptions, let's first teach that 2 and 2 make 4. I'm pleased to notice that you haven't collapsed in shock. And as a result of that, I'm emboldened to introduce a few more simple, even childish terms. Words like shame and stigma and embarrassment. And here, if you'll let me, I'd like to flaunt the thing that my brief sojourn in academia has taught me. If you footnote it, it's not stealing. I'm about to steal shamelessly from the British philosopher Digby Anderson, but as I understand the rules, if you will imagine a footnote referring to his book, The Laws of Virtue, I think I can avoid indictment for ethical breaches and plagiarism. Digby Anderson was in Washington last month at the Ethics and Public Policy Center and gave a little talk in which he said that until recently, certain ideas were out of bounds, beyond the pale, or in his Briticism, quite out of court. He said if you'd claimed in the 1930s that to have an illegitimate child and to bring it up without a father was just another lifestyle choice, people would have just died laughing, he said. Or if you'd said that vegetarianism was just as sensible a way of life as any other, folks would have just collapsed in laughter. Some ideas, he said, were just in the shadows, not taken seriously, not put on the table. Now you have to understand that Digby Anderson wasn't arguing against any of these particular ideas or claims. His point, befitting this pre-ethics lecture, was much simpler. He was saying that our mistake is that we have let all ideas in. More to the point, once an idea is accepted as being tolerable, we allow it to claim full rights to equal expression with all other ideas, with everything else. And it moves to center stage. No idea, however absurd or outlandish or laughable it may be, can be dismissed out of hand. We just won't do it. It's not seemly anymore. You just watch the TV talk shows. Anything is fair game, while the host of these shows pretend to be really terribly serious and involved in, cross-dressing sons who date their mother's boyfriends. The danger that Anderson talks about is in our failure to sanction ideas to test them, to resist them even. We run the risk of getting things too easily on the table and find ourselves too easily confused. I guess he would say that in the marketplace of ideas, not every notion that comes down the pike deserves prime shelf space. But what of those ideas that, apparently absurd, turn out to be really brilliant and revolutionary? I mean, at least a few of Copernicus's contemporaries must have collapsed laughing at some of his ideas, don't you think? And the audience at the maiden performance of Stravinsky's unconventional Le Sacre du Printemps must have, well, they not only thought it was absurd, they came within an eighth of rioting at the first performance of The Rite of Spring. They thought it was just bloody awful. Now it's a classic, it's wonderful music. Doesn't that say that we ought to let all the ideas in? Because we can't know which are the great ones and which are the ones that will turn out to have been silly? Well, you might listen to James Fitzjames Stephen, who wasn't bothered a bit by intolerance for the apparently absurd idea. Let them not be tolerated, he said. A bit of suffering, a little bit of being knocked about by the mainstream may be good for them. If they are worthy ideas, they'll survive and they will have earned their place. They will have been given a chance to prove themselves. But this is pre-ethics, and even this overcomplicates what I want to say, which is merely that we are losing, through disuse, the shields that used to keep the more outlandish and unsettling ideas and practices at bay, or at any rate to confine their use to those who were thoughtful about their defiance of convention. These protective shields included very much things like ridicule and laughter and shame. These were our mechanisms for enforcing virtue, for making people, even unreflective people, good. Making people good? What an extraordinary and controversial thought that is. Unfortunately, this is not the time or place to pursue it. This is, after all, just pre-ethics, and I don't want to get you too involved in these controversial things. But because it's pre-ethics, and in keeping with that notion, let me propose that we spend the balance of our time discussing what might be described as the pre-ethical attitude. There are people, perhaps even in this room, who already are ethical, who not only know right, but also practice right, driven by deeply held conviction. But if this lecture series is to be worth its underwriting, it must offer something for the rest of us, who are not yet quite full-fledged ethical beings. I offer, in all modesty, hypocrisy. I've scoured the university catalog, talked with a few dozen members of the Duke faculty, and chatted on a number of occasions with President Kenan. And as far as I can tell, nobody at Duke is teaching you the first thing about hypocrisy. I'm sure you run into a few hypocrites now and then during your years at Duke. You do manage to get off campus now and then. But my research over nearly 2 full semesters suggests that you have been taught to abhor hypocrisy. Your professors have conspired to give hypocrisy a bad name. And actually, there's nothing very new in any of that. Hypocrisy has had a bad name virtually since the beginning of time. And that's not what bothers me, really. What does bother me is that in recent years, we have stopped the actual practice of hypocrisy. And that, my friends, is a terrible mistake. I suppose I first noticed it, 20-odd years ago, when George and Nina O'Neill came out with their blockbuster book, Open Marriage, A New Lifestyle for Couples. And although Nina O'Neill later recanted in a book she called The Marriage Premise, she denies it was a recantation, the damage had already been done. It occurred to me then, the beginning of the end of that most unappreciated of virtues, hypocrisy. See, the alluring theory behind what was happening is that one should not feel guilty for doing what one really wanted to do. It seemed almost biblical in its contention that the wanting to do it was the critical thing. Indeed, not doing what you really wanted to do was nothing more than unhealthy repression, a sort of desirus interruptus. But if the theory was attractive, the practice has been devastating. We are still paying the price for our abandonment of hypocrisy in everything from family breakdown to drug-spawned crime, to devastated neighborhoods, to the short-sighted selfishness that threatens to erode our institutions, wreck our economy, and topple the pillars of our society. And what, you ask, does hypocrisy have to do with all this? This. The let it all hang out amorality that crashed in upon us in the 1970s accepts no standard, no morality, no code of behavior outside the minds of those engaging in the behavior. We don't need to practice such quaint notions as forgiveness anymore. We don't even need to be civil. The idea is that it's okay to do whatever crosses your mind as long as you don't hurt anybody. Hypocrisy recognizes that the erosion of standards hurts everybody. It accepts the sanctity of ethical standards even while violating them. Hypocrisy says, what I'm doing is wrong. Therefore, I must not do it too often. I must pretend I'm not doing it at all. And I must take great care not to be caught doing it. And that helps enormously with your behavior. La Rochefoucauld said it 300 years ago. Hypocrisy, he said, is the homage that vice pays to virtue. Just about 20 years ago, the late philosopher Will Heiberg said it again. It is my belief, he wrote, that the really serious threat to morality in our time consists not in the multiplying violations of an accepted moral code, but in the fact that the very notion of morality seems itself to be losing its meaning for increasing numbers of men and women in our society. To violate moral standards, he said, while at the same time acknowledging their authority is one thing. To lose all sense of the moral claim, to repudiate all moral authority and every moral standard as such is something far, far more serious. It is the loss of this moral sense, he suggests, that constitutes the real challenge to morality in our time. Now, I'm not advocating that you should violate the moral authority, the moral standards you've learned at Duke or at home before you came to Duke. I'm only saying that you probably will. And that you shouldn't let the violations erode the standards. If preaching standards that we know will be violated, perhaps even by those of us doing the preaching, is hypocrisy, then let's hear it for hypocrisy. The most casual look at what's happening to our society tells me that we have got to work at bringing back a certain level of hypocrisy. Now, suppose I sound like every other aging parent who insists that the world is going to hell of a handbasket, that when I say that today's young people are so awful that we have to wonder how parents like us could have produced them. Well, I don't believe that people are less virtuous now than they were before the decline of hypocrisy. But their behavior is worse. You see, being wicked, which young people are inclined from time to be, takes a lot worse behavior now than it used to. Because we forgive so much, we understand so much. Marital infidelity, which used to be thought of correctly as cheating, is now considered normal, perhaps even healthy and helpful. Sharp business practices, which once were considered shameful, are now thought to be smart. Never mind that the push for bigger and quicker profits has led to a host of financial manipulations that, while making a few individuals enormously rich, add nothing to the nation's productive capacity or its ability to compete in global markets. It may be the sheerest hypocrisy to go around saying that, no, money doesn't really matter all that much to me. But the abandonment of the standards that occasion that hypocrisy is eroding our ability to produce the educators, the caregivers, the poets, and the painstaking artisans that our society needs. Think of standards as an electrified fence that describes the limits of acceptable behavior. We are constantly tempted to cross the fence, and all of us at one time or another yield to that temptation. But the violation both thrills us and shocks us into a return to the confines of the fence. The deadly revolution came when, instead of boosting the current in the fence, we simply moved it back to accommodate our actual behavior. You remember the 55-mile-per-hour speed limit? And people drove 60. And the authorities said, well, look, why turn all these wonderful, upright people into scofflaws just because they're 5 miles over the limit? For heaven's sake, let's just raise the limit to 60. This is what decent people drive. Well, of course, you raise the limit to 60 and they drive 65, and you raise it to 65 and they drive 80. You get what I call normative morality. That is a morality based not on what is right, but on what people actually do. And since human beings are forever inclined to test the limits, we keep moving the fence. I mean, what's so terrible about doing a little dope when nearly everybody's doing a little dope? I mean, what's the harm in cheating on your taxes or on your spouse when everybody else is cheating? What's the point of teaching our children that adolescent sex is wrong as opposed to merely pragmatically risky, when the statistical evidence is that most kids are doing it? The field of acceptable behavior has been expanded to the point where everything goes and nothing thrills. So you see why I speak in praise of hypocrisy. Hypocrisy recognizes the importance of keeping the fence in place, and thus keeps even our wicked thrills within reasonable limits. So my advice as I close this pre-ethics lecture is that we must resurrect hypocrisy, that we must learn to pretend that we are better than we actually are. Pretend that your association with this fine university has made you different from, a bit superior to, ordinary men and women. Pretend as you leave here and begin your careers to be personally interested in your employer's business and concerned about its success. Pretend that you really do believe there are things more important than making a buck, that your spouse, your family, your standing in the community, you're doing your bit to improve the world, that all these things are more important to you than getting rich. Pretend to love justice, even when its application results in your personal disadvantage. Pretend these things convincingly enough and for long enough, and you will find that they have become a part of that most powerful ethics-enforcing mechanism, good habit. You'll keep doing them because they feel natural to do. That can't be bad. You will still try to make a buck. But your carefully cultivated hypocrisy will induce you to devote some of your income and some of your time to helping others. You'll still keep your eye open for the main chance, but your pretense that your employer's business success is a major concern of yours will make you a competent and valued employee, both in your initial job and in the half dozen others that the statisticians say you'll have between now and the time you retire. You will have still the occasionally wandering eye, but your pretense that your spouse is the sole object of your romantic notions will lead you to a surprising degree of fidelity. And the guilt your hypocrisy evokes will lead you to compensate for your occasional faithlessness by paying special devotion to your spouse. You will go through periods when you will see your children as impediments to your career. But if you perfect the hypocrisy of pretending that your children matter more than any career success ever could, you will find that they really do matter more. And you will turn out wonderful, confident, unselfish children. No, I'm not suggesting that you abandon your interest in doing well. I'm asking that you also feign an interest in doing good. Let us perfect the hypocritical art of pretending to be the sort of person we admire, of pretending to be better than we are. Pretend hard enough and long enough, and you'll be amazed to discover how much better, how much more admirable you in fact will become. It's only pre-ethics, I know that. But maybe it'll do until the real thing comes along. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Bill. I'm sure there will be many questions. So you're up for it.
Yes. Okay.
I like your emphasis on hypocrisy as a virtue of my former colleague, late colleague, called an ordinary vice. I call it ordinary vice. You could have mentioned, as she did, that it's a peculiar virtue of liberal society. Hitler is not one we're not interested in. Bill Clinton is, and most of us would prefer Bill Clinton to this society. But I wanted to ask you a more difficult question, because there are two parts of your talk. The second part, which I endorse, is the defense of hypocrisy. The first part, you claim that we should be intolerant of certain new ideas. And I wondered whether you thought that the desirability of having standards with the defense of hypocrisy implies that intolerance for new ideas about those standards is justified. It appeared to me you were confusing ideas with practices. You might have said that certain practices which are undefended we should be intolerant of. I wasn't sure you meant to say that we should be intolerant of ideas, for example, defenses of new practices which might be more justified than different.
I think we might be well advised to be resistant to ideas that go against the grain, not because the new ideas are wrong, but because they may be. And if we allow them full and immediate unresisting play, we run risk. And we see the risk play out on campuses and politics and in other ways. I suggest that it may be not wrong to think that the good idea, the sound new idea, won't go away just because you and I resist it. And if it overcomes our resistance, or at least achieves our tolerance, it may be a very good thing. If we are uncritical of new ideas and practices, we will find it exceedingly difficult, I think, to maintain the very standards that this whole discussion of ethics is about. It seems to me you can't have an undifferentiated ethics. That you have to judge certain ideas and practices superior to other ideas and practices, knowing that you may be quite wrong about your judgment, your initial judgment. Yes.
I think I know what you'll say to this, Bill, but maybe the difference of moralism versus morality. But if we think back 50 years ago, the time when we were talking about the world as being balancing good and evil, communism and democracy, and those ideas were prevalent in the entire culture, domestically as well as internationally. We had the suggestion that we should think about natural health insurance. That suggestion was dismissed as dangerous and immoral because it would bring us towards socialism and communism. Now, it may well be that that was a false kind of ethical standard. But there certainly was a pattern of morality that surrounded that debate. And an idea was ruled out of consideration because it was seen to be in violation of what moral thing. How does that fit into your...
Yeah. I think we very likely would not have had a decent health care program if we had not resisted the idea of socialized medicine. We may wind up with something very close to socialized medicine. I frankly am attracted to the Canadian notion of health care. But I think we will do it better, and we'll find it has greater acceptance if we allow the initial resistance to it. Just as we will do better if we resist the present ideas that we should, with Charles Murray, simply eliminate our support of the poor and the needy. Just eliminate welfare, it'll be good for people. That may turn out to be true. I think we'll be better off as a society if we initially resist the idea and force it to prove itself, force ourselves to think about it, force those who propose the notion to say it again in ways that don't sound so harsh and that make some sense to us. If we force them to keep coming back with their idea so that if it has any sense to it, we'll begin to see the sense, then it has a reasonable a chance of becoming acceptable. But if we don't resist it, we'll simply savage poor people and not be a better society for it. Yes?
I guess I want to ask you, Mr. Raspberry, two questions. Unlike Bob, I disagree with everything you said. Although I did think of his former colleague, Jim Starr, about hypocrisy. She called it ordinary vice, which occurs in liberals. I like that. That's something like dialectic between idealism and realism. Hypocrisy is saying one thing and to be one way. And you did have an empirical hypothesis about that in your talk. It had to do with the fact that on dialogue, where Plato's opponents always say, better to seem such than evil. They didn't take away the lesson of seeming will take you along with seeming. That's not reasonable. I was worried what you said about children in the 70s. I thought that there's a way of teaching generation of relatives where
church, because things become acceptable, highly, then everything goes. I really want to believe that. I don't think that people of my generation think that. Including many within fidelity.
You're stretching my ability to recall the things you say to me. Maybe.
Let me get to the correct question.
Oh, okay.
We talked about memory over dinner.
I forgot.
Here's one example. Kenan Hoff Sommers, who quoted a lot in your talk, is a person who is a very powerful, conservative, anti-feminist voice. He thinks that feminism is the root of things like high divorce rate, you name it, privacy. I found that a very peculiar person to be dispersed on the issue of immorality. She does buy into this rhetoric, time, and everything fell apart at that point.
Is that the question?
Well, my question is simply this: do you believe that story?
If you're asking me whether I believe in Christine Hoff Sommers' anti-feminism, the answer is I don't. I'm astounded, though, at the implication that if I disagree with somebody on one of their more public points, I can't agree with anything they say that makes sense to me. If we divide the world up into good people and bad people, good guys, bad guys, that way, and we know who the bad guys are, and the bad guys say something that otherwise would make sense to us, but we are duty-bound to reject it because they are bad guys, I don't know how we get out of this place alive. Christine Hoff Sommers, on the thing I cited her on, made some sense to me. I found it interesting. I find that some of the more interesting notions on social policy issues that are being knocked around today come from people I wouldn't have lunch with. And I find that the people I adore discovered truth in 1949 and have not found it necessary to think about anything since then. I'd like people who think about things and who make me think about things. If you force me to do the ad hominem thing, she's a bad person because she's an anti-feminist, for God's sake. She's Phyllis Schlafly. And if Phyllis Schlafly says today is Wednesday, I must be really suspicious of that statement. I must not allow it to be accepted as truth. I know people, I have close friends who operate that way. I tell you, I simply cannot. I can't. I find myself naturally reaching for the truth in what you say to me. And in some of those things, and I promise you I can't retain them all, some of the things you said in your build-up were things that I hadn't thought through, but I found myself agreeing with you as you said them, although I knew you were winding up to throw a hard, fast one at me. I have to accept from you what makes sense to me. I hope you can accept from me any part of what I say that makes sense to you and not think that one takes the whole package or nothing. I don't think we get anywhere that way.
I agree with you about that.
Okay. As to the generational thing, any statement you make about any cohort of people is wrong. You know that, I know that. It's probably also right. If we don't indulge ourselves the occasional generality, we can't have a conversation. Okay, yeah.
Growing up, we were told by many that it's impossible to live. The implication that simple habits and behaviors may change one's outlook on life and perhaps different ways of seeing things. I wonder am I interpreting you correctly?
There is no question in my mind that changing habits changes attitudes. Changing what you do changes how you think and feel. I didn't know that. I don't know when I learned that. I learned it when I was in boot camp back around the turn of the century, when we were forced to go into a little shack that had been filled with tear gas, and the idea was to teach us to, after the attack, put our gas mask on and save ourselves. So we go into this place without the gas mask on, and it's terrible. I finally get to the point. What happened was that because the tear gas made me cry, and crying is associated in my mind with sadness, I felt uncontrollably sad just because the tear gas made me cry. The physical act changed my mind and my attitudes. Let me say something that makes a little more sense about that. The first time, it must have been 30 years ago, because I've been married just under 30 years. The first time I took my wife to Mississippi, she's a Washington, D.C. native, and was afraid to death of Mississippi. We went to the J.C. Penney store and made a purchase, Tupelo, Mississippi, and the white sales clerk who waited on us, a middle-aged woman, kept finding ways to delay us. We paid for the thing, we were trying to leave, and she would make small talk and she'd keep us around. And it finally dawned on us why she was keeping us around. Her new colleague had been out to lunch and she was due back about then. She knew we were from out of town and assumed that we had some very negative ideas about Mississippi, and she wanted us to see her new black sales colleague. And she made one excuse or another to keep us there until this woman got back. And then she, with great pride, introduced us. Now, this was a woman, and I don't know this, I'll generalize again, but I'm assuming that she 2 years earlier would have thought, I can't work with these black folks. They don't know what they're doing, and it just ain't right. But the new rules forced new ways of dealing and forced new habits. And she found herself a better person than she had thought herself capable of being. And she was damned glad of it. I think if we can learn to do what we believe to be right, even when we'd rather be doing something else, that the good feeling we get from that and the good feedback we get from others will confirm the habit, and we'll find ourselves doing right often without thinking about it. Yes?
I'd like to explore something which I'm not sure how actually it's going to work out. I mean, the essence of your discussion of hypocrisy is that by doing the thing that we think we should do, we will eventually become the thing that we think we should do. Is that right?
That's very close, and I won't resist the rest of it unless the rest of the question forces me to.
Okay, fine.
Okay.
Now, when we take that, when we take the other part of the problem, it elevates social norms, established it sets the established social norms as something we should be respected. Very conservative notion.
I think ethics unavoidably is a conservative idea, but go on.
But in the psychology, it makes it extremely difficult and unlikely in a society conservative one just in the first place. That same will fit changes will be. Because in fact, in a society in which there's an enormous respect return to internalized better norms, we establish forms of behavior. Now, in principle, I might accept that, except that when I think about it, I'm a little older, so my generation is acceptable. So I guess that has become real. I still find it, I have a strong feeling to change and to challenge me. I find it difficult to accept a form of social philosophy or a form of ethics which places as much weight on the established set of beliefs or norms as we study psychology posed in the second part.
Yeah, I'm not sure I know what to say to your resistance to the idea, except that the resistance is probably a good thing. If you took willy-nilly what I said and didn't resist it, and took what somebody else said and didn't resist that, the final outcome would likely be a muddle in your head. You have a set of ideas and ideals. I've said something to you that runs against that grain, and you resist it. And you think about what you're doing. You're doing precisely what I said was not a bad thing to do. But you're resisting what I said to you. I submit you ought to resist it until I can persuade you that it makes sense. How is what you're doing in any way different from what I proposed that you do?
And it squeezes change out of society. It squeezes change only the most iconoclast, the most resistant, the most willing to challenge, perhaps for other reasons.
You will perhaps tell me the 2 or 3 significant changes in the history of humankind that were unresisted and therefore came in quickly and efficaciously. I can't think of them off the top of my head. It seems to me that everything from Christianity to the Civil Rights Movement met very sharp resistance and was refined and improved by the resistance. Now, am I suggesting that the resistance ought always be successful? Of course not. Am I suggesting that in the ideal world, you see, I think here's where we sort of get taken beyond what I said. If I suggest that resisting the new idea and practice is a wise thing, somebody will conclude that therefore I believe the resistance ought to be successful and the new idea and practice kept out. I don't believe that. I don't know really anybody who does. But if everybody who had put an idea on the table about the makeup of the universe had been given full credit as though his idea was as the equal of every other idea, I don't think the result would have been an advance for science. Yes?
Yes, Professor Esbert. I had a question about, you spoke of now that we've had this generation, my generation, since the 70s, that has been raised in this kind of morally relative time, and the ball's been rolling for so long. I mean, even in my brief lifespan, we've seen that the levels of violence in both the media and in society have increased, and drug use and a lot of different behaviors have become more acceptable. How would you propose to slow the rate of all that?
How would I propose what?
How would you propose to begin to reverse some of those ideas, the rate of change in some of those ideas?
You must enroll in my fall class 196. I'm not sure. I have some ideas about what we ought to be doing, or at any rate thinking about doing. I don't think I can, in answer to a question, make very much sense on reversing some rather baleful trends of 30 years in the answer to a single question. It's a good question, and one I spend a lot of time thinking about. But I think it's too big for right now. Yeah.
I understood you to be talking about what we normally call personal morality, but Dean Chafe asked a question that put it on a larger scale when he asked his question about socialized medicine. I'm curious to know if you were talking on the personal morality level, that is to say, how people behave individually, as opposed to how does society solve its problems. And if you feel, in fact, that there is a line that can be drawn between the two, and how you would define that line.
Yeah, I guess I'm not saying anything quite as grand as your paraphrase makes it. What I'm saying, I think, is this: that to begin with societal morality is too big a thing for most of us to handle until, the first step is to persuade ourselves and each other that we ought to do right when we know what right is. Once we've done that, then we can start thinking about what groups ought to do, what communities ought to do, what nations ought to do. But my fear is that we jump immediately to what nations ought to do before we figure out even how we ought to behave as individual men and women. And I think I'm simply suggesting that we get the order of things correct. I'm not suggesting that there's no such thing as societal or national or even world morality or ethics, but I do think it's important to get the order correct. I think they're going to make me shut up, but I do very much appreciate the questions, especially the sticky ones I got tonight. I will spend some time thinking about those questions, even some of those to which I gave smart aleck answers. They haven't gone out of my head, and I will think about them. And it's one of the delights of my experience at this university is that I have been required to think about things that I thought I knew already. Thank you for that.
Thank you very much, Bill Raspberry, for that very provocative and thoughtful lecture in pre-ethics, which also made us think about some very tough intellectual issues in ethics. Just as one example as we close of the many ways in which very practical reflections connect with the kind of high theory that we teach in the university classrooms, your talk actually took me back to one of my favorite intellectual homes, early modern France, and made me think about two great ethicists, Pascal and Montaigne, who are often considered very conservative thinkers, but who were in many ways very revolutionary. Many of you who know Pascal will think first of the wager, his sense that we don't know whether God exists, but if you consider the odds, it's better to behave as though he does. And I think one of the things that Professor Raspberry was telling us was we don't know if there's any morality out there, but it's better to behave as though it is, because of the consequences for us personally and for the society. And so, as Pascal said, if we continue to bend our knee, even if we don't initially believe, before long, we will find through that habit that we have come to believe in the good. It's a very powerful message, and this is what I heard you say in the essence of what you were proposing. And you were also making it collective rather than simply individual, which I think is a wonderful twist. But you were also giving another message, as I heard you, of Montaigne, who said, long before Pascal, in a society like the one I live in, like the one we live in, I will bend my knee to things which may not by any means be perfect, but which are important for me to subject myself to make society work. I'll bend my knee, but not my judgment. And I will hold back in a private room the possibility of reserving thought about things that are even better, so that moral progress can occur, and that someday people might bend their knees to an even better society. And that, I think, is what we would all look forward to. Now, more immediately, we look forward to a reception in the faculty lounge, which the Fuqua School of Business, our host tonight, has helped provide for us. We invite all of you to come, tell Professor Raspberry what you thought about his talk, and give him a chance to field your questions. Thank you so much.